The scramble for Africa is, I believe, one of the most poorly understood periods in history. From what I gather, most people seem to believe that the colonial power Sundays at around a map at the Berlin Conference drawing borders around bits they wanted. And that was it, but the scramble had already began by the time of the conference of 1884. Plus, the conference data that any claimant must show effective occupation of a region before it was granted to them. This meant in some instances there were literal races between explorers far more intense than destroying lines on a map during the scramble. Great powers like Britain and France nearly went to war. It brought about a revolution in Portugal. And I'd argue, with the exception of maybe the Zulus and Ethiopians, the Africans and their battles against colonialism are often just completely ignored. Plus, the fact that some African countries like Egypt and Ethiopia actually expanded is also often glossed over. But to understand the scramble, you really need to go back in time. Well, maybe you don't, but there's some fascinating empires, wars, and cultural exchanges. Beforehand, the first European colonies in Africa were set up by the Portuguese bases along their route to India. These include Madeira in the Atlantic, Savia and Mozambique, Luanda in Angola, and Mombasa and Zanzibar in East Africa. These all proved to be important stopover points for international trade. And this was pretty much the standard for colonialism at that time. It was far more profitable to set up factories for trade and control sea lands, rather than taking over entire regions. As such, the Portuguese would also set up colonies in the spices land Shormal, Zan Persian. Important to this story, in Oman the Spanish and Portuguese had agreed to divide the world in two, so they had little competition from Europeans in Africa. But late in the 16th century, the Iberian Union united Portugal with Spain, and as such the Portuguese entered into Spain's wars against the Dutch and the English. The Dutch were quick to move into the colonial game and took Mena from the Portuguese. They expanded in West Africa, established the Dutch slave coast, and built forts in Senegal. Plus, for a few decades, they even held Portuguese Luand. A while in the south, in the middle of the 17th century, they entered Cape Town, an important midway point for ship sailing between the oceans. The Dutch that settled in this region became the Boers. However, the locals in South Africa that they encountered during this period were not the Zulus. They were the Kwekwe. These are often grouped together with the Santer gatherers, but they were a distinct group of people. The Zulu, on the other hand, didn't enter the picture for another few decades, as they were Bantu who migrated from the north. However, to further complicate matters, there were also the Coaster in South Africa at that time, and they are closely related to the Bantu. There is some debate over when the Xhosa arrived, but their languages shows that overshadows the West African gold trade. The desire for gold was not just among a few rich Europeans looking to get even richer, but the beginning of the age of exploration. It was essential for the survival of the European economies. This is because from 1457 to 1464, there was a bullion famine, and the Europeans were running out of gold and silver. This was in part caused by wars like the 100 Years' War and the huge trade deficit. The Europeans shared with Asia's Europeans began exploring and discovered West Africa and their gold mines. And these practically saved Europe. The gold from this region was so well circulated in Europe that this is where you get the name of the old Guinea coins from, because where else but Guinea could you get such a large quantity of gold? As such, there were numerous African states that popped up along the coast. Here Benin and Oyo, for instance, had been around since medieval times, while others like Dahomey and Ashanti came about around 16 to 1700. But there's almost too many to mention in this summary. In the far reaches of West Africa around modern-day Senegal, there was the powerful Jollof Empire, but by the middle of the 16th century, Tour broke free, and the empire disintegrated into various states. However, as the Europeans began to enter West Africa, stories began to emerge of previous settlers in the region. For instance, in the 1600s, the French claimed that they had evidence of the Normans raiding the West African coast back in the 1300s. This was based on documents which have now disappeared, and the alleged testimony of an 130-year-old Guinea man. He apparently won the French battery in the region. But without those original documents, it's impossible to know if this was based on any truth. Another story came from the Jinnos, who had their own explorers in medieval times and the early modern period. The most well-known was, of course, Columbus, but there was also the Vivaldi brothers, who tried to circumnavigate Africa way back in the 13th century. They, however, disappeared en route, but Antonio Tusso de Maria, later explorer writing over 150 years later, claimed to have found their descendants. Now, Yusso Damari was a nearly traveler in Africa hoping to gain funding for future expeditions, so his reports are often filled with exaggerations and lies. For instance, he wrote of the incredibly rich lands of Presta John along the Gambia River, and weirdly a group of people speaking the Genos dialect, so apparently the great-great-grandchildren of the Vivaldi brothers. Now the medieval explorers may not have made it to West Africa, but ancient people did. The Phoenicians, for instance, explored the area, and Henoth the Navigator eventually to enslave guerrillas way back in the 5th century BC, but though successful trade stopped in medieval times, that's not to say that Europe was completely cut off from West Africa. Obviously, the gold found its way from West Africa to Europe, but some strange items might have traveled the other way, like in the 19th century. The British took over Ashanti and discovered ore dating back to the 1300s. It was inscribed with the English royal seal of the time and had English writing along the side, so it was clearly made in Plantagenet, England, but how it arrived there remains a mystery. Did it come with slave traders later on in the 18th century, or did it embark on a great medieval journey, being traded people from Spain, Morocco, Mali and the likes before finding its new home in the Ashanti Kingdom? It's really hard to know now. Back in West Africa was a powerful empire. Just to the east of Senegal, the Songhai Empire they had largely drove the Mali Empire into dead. decline and took the city of Timbuktu from them, but the Songhai Empire had all but collapsed by the 1600s, and their defeat didn't come at the hands of the Europeans, but Morocco. The Moroccans of northern Africa in 1578 had fought back a Portuguese invasion, and their new Sultan Ahmed al-Mansur launched an invasion south and crushed the Songhai. The Moroccans at this point were so powerful that they were seen as a potential ally for the Juda dynasty and the French, who hoped to fight against their mutual enemy of Spain. Plus the Moroccans were so convinced that they could defeat the Spanish that al-Mansur planned on how to divide up the Spanish colonies in the America. However, their rule over West Africa didn't last long. The logistics of maintaining such a large empire across the Sahara proved to be too hard, especially after plept through the region, killing al-Mansur and weakening the kingdom. So they retreated back north just a couple decades later. And this brings me to one of the most forgotten colonizers of Africa, the Muslims of the north. After the Ottomans defeated the Mamluks in the early 1500s, they annexed Egypt, and this in turn opened their path to taking coastal by Algeria and Tunisia. These would later become the Barbary states, which infamously would launch pirate attacks on ships passing through the Mediterranean Sea. And if any nation wanted safe passage, they would have to pay their respective countries tribute. Many Europeans would join the ranks of these pirates, notably Yenny, and soon a Dutch pirate who wanted to attack their Spanish enemy under his command. The pirates would launch raids as far north as Sealand, where they captured hundreds of people in the 1620s. These people, like many Europeans at that time, were then brought back to the Barbary states and sold as slaves. Now this slave trade at its height from around 1580 to 1680 probably saw close to 1 million Europeans enslaved, then brought to North African states. But if I were to add this number to the number of Christians enslaved by the Ottomans to fill in the ranks of the Janissaries and their likes, the number would of course be a lot higher. Also during this period, the pirates temporarily took over the English's land of London near Bristol, while back in Morocco they formed their own republic, the Republic of Sali. Among the population of this republic, there were many Christian converts to Islam like Yenny and Soon, plus there were many Muslims who were forcibly evicted from Spain in the decades prior. And also a collection of Jewish pirates who also wanted some revenge against the Spanish for kicking them out of their home, the Ottomans, and the Muslim pirates were therefore the most dominant force in North Africa.